Well, hello, friends. I am happy to say that I've got Dr. Mark Wilson on again. He's an expert on how archaeology contributes to our understanding of the Bible. He has a particular focus and actually wrote his doctoral dissertation on the seven churches of Asia. And so I'm excited to hear his perspective on the date of Revelation. If you want to learn more about Dr. Wilson, I'll have some information in the description, and you watch the previous interview that I did with him. But Dr. Wilson, could you kind of wade into this debate a little bit for us? There's some people that think that the Book of Revelation ought to be dated. Maybe in the 90s or maybe even a little later than that, and some would date it prior to the fall of Jerusalem. This is an area of research for you, and I'm kind of curious to hear what your perspective is on that.
So Revelation, early in my own academic career, became a focus of my study. And I very soon came to the conclusion that the date of Revelation is very important for its interpretation. And the two views you've outlined there, I mean, there's a gap, 25 years, basically between those, which makes a huge difference in how we understand what's happening within the book itself. And as I began to look at the history behind all of this, seeing the tremendous upheaval that was going on in the Roman Empire in the late 60s, and then what was happening under Domitian in the 90s, it's a difference between night and day in terms of a rhetorical situation of where you're going to put Revelation. And so as a result of that, very early in my own studies, to me, early dating in around 69, before the fall of Jerusalem, makes so much more sense in understanding what's happening in the book.
Could you start kind of unpacking that a little bit for us? Why did you come to that conclusion?
At the end of the 60s, there's so much going on just from the Roman Empire itself. I mean, it's called the Year of the Four Emperors. I mean, can you imagine thinking from an American perspective of having four presidents in 1 year? I mean, the tremendous instability that's going on there. So you have Galba Otho Vitellius, and then Vespasian emerges, as the emperor at the end of that time. And then you've got the Jewish war going on in Jerusalem, in the Greek East there, with Titus, the son of Vespasian, finally taking the holy city, and the temple is destroyed. And of course, this has been prophesied by Jesus, in the Olivet Discourse that you find in all the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So this is a fulfillment of a prophecy that in this generation, these things are going to take place. So we have that important background as well. And then we see the turmoil that's going on even among the cities in the province of Asia in the midst of all of this. And so as you look at all of this, it really points to this as a time. And of course, the two great apostles, Peter and Paul, have just perished in the first great persecution that took place in Rome, Babylon, after the Great Fire under Nero there. And then, of course, in AD 68, you have the suicide of Nero that precipitates the whole power struggle that takes place then in 69. And so there's just external historical events going on. And I think these are reflected in a number of texts in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you wrote an article at some point talking about fake news, right? Fake news of the persecution under Domitian. There's a lot that's made of the fact. So whenever you date the Book of Revelation, it does seem like it has to be some period of great turmoil, some period of great trouble that's arising. I think this led some 19th century scholars like Philip Schaff. I think the three well-known Cambridge scholars, Lightfoot, Westcott, and Hort, they all, and a number of other scholars during the 19th century were very much into this idea that it had to be somewhere prior to the fall of Jerusalem because of the turmoil. But there are other scholars who have said, well, yeah, but we've got something pretty comparable under Domitian. There's this great persecution that's going to happen under Domitian. And so it's very possible to see that, that Domitian would have basically created similar turmoil in his persecution against Christians. What would you respond to with something like that?
I mean, you have see this kind of being reflected first by Eusebius, but when you look in the historical record, and I've read biographies of Domitian, I think we have to go outside of biblical studies to Roman historians and read about that. And they mention nothing about a persecution of Christians. The problem that Domitian has with people inside the imperial household and the Roman Senate. And yes, people did die under his hand, and this is, of course, why later after his assassination, the Senate proclaimed what's called damnatio memoriae, where his name is damned, his memory is damned, his name is erased from inscriptions, his statues are destroyed, and it was that because of this and his persecution of the Roman elite and not Christians that caused his memory to be damned.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It's interesting to see this because if there wasn't a major persecution of Christians under Domitian, it seems odd that the Book of Revelation seems to be dealing with this idea of Christians being persecuted and this imminence of something big is at the door for whoever this book is being written for. And if there isn't this persecution under Domitian, the timing doesn't seem to quite fit the sort of I don't know how to say it, but the fireworks, if you will, of the Book of
Yeah, yeah,
Revelation.
yeah. Yeah, and you have a lot of clues inside the book. For example, the whole idea of the beast who's died and come back to life again. I mean, this was the whole interesting phenomenon called Nero Redivivus or Nero Redux that we find in Roman history at this period. Is that people simply didn't believe that Nero, who in the second part of his reign became such a despot, was dead. And so we have pretenders then who come along very early, the first one in AD 69, claiming to be Nero returned to life. And so we see this reflected in the book of Revelation. And we have this in the Roman historians documenting this phenomenon. And two more pretenders actually emerge in years subsequent. So that's I think, one of the internal clues of something that's going on here related to Nero.
How do you assess the argument that some people have made from Revelation chapter 11, so that whether or not you see the temple there as a literal temple or just a picture, it seems like from the viewpoint of many of us that John is portraying it as still standing. Do you think that's a good argument, or would you think that's maybe just a contributing factor? How would you assess the idea that, I mean, if the temple, in other words, if the temple had just been destroyed, it would seem like, I know this is an argument from silence, but it would seem like it would be odd that John doesn't mention it, since this would be a huge confirmation of what Jesus had taught. And not only
Yeah.
that, but he portrays it as still standing, even if you understand it symbolically. Would that factor into your thinking at all on this?
Yeah, I think that John does, in fact, still see the temple as standing, in his perspective there, and that the fact that he, has come out of Jerusalem again, heeding the warning of Jesus. He said, when you see the Romans encamped around the city, the Christians are to leave. And so, of course, in one of the traditions, we have some of the Jerusalem believers going across the Jordan to Pella, to a place of retreat. But I think this is when, for example, we have a tradition of Philip, the apostle, coming to Hierapolis and living there, and then John coming to Ephesus and basically filling the spiritual vacuum. Then now with both Peter and Paul dead, he now becomes the apostle of Asia that is there. But they're coming at this time out of the war zone now to Western Asia Minor.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to note, maybe some of my viewers might not appreciate this, but the fall of Jerusalem for a first century Jew wasn't like something you forget about 5 years later. This would have been, I mean, imagine like for Americans, 9/11 was everybody remembers where they were at 9/11. But I think for a first century Jew, and you can speak into this and tell me if I'm wrong, but for a first century Jew, for the temple to fall would have been something of even a higher magnitude than something like 9/11 was for an American. Would that be accurate, you think, Dr. Wilson?
Sure. I mean, here in Asia Minor, I mean, you got more Jews living outside of Israel in the first century than in Israel. We probably have 1 million Jews living here in Asia Minor, at this time. I mean, we have Jewish communities textually and epigraphically that are all over in these major cities around us here. And you see this of course, Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost. We have 5 different locations in Asia Minor where Jews are making pilgrimage there. And so, number one, you've got a disruption, just in the lifestyle of Jews, regularly traveling to Jerusalem to the temple for one of the 3 feasts. But then we also have records of people sending from these communities money, the temple tax, on a regular basis to do that. They're collecting money in all these Jewish communities to do that. And so 2 major disruptions just in their connection of diaspora Jews with the center there in Jerusalem and the temple that suddenly is gone. And of course, no more sacrifices in Judaism after the destruction of the temple there too, which fundamentally changes Jewish worship, becomes much more synagogue focused now.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you have time, Dr. Wilson, I'd like to throw at least three objections that some people will have against an early date. And when I say early date, I say anything really prior to 70. There's some early date advocates. I would be one that I would be kind of more inclined to a Nero date, which I understand there's pushback on that, but something before 80, 70, I would consider to be an early date. But what I would like to ask you some of the objections that people have to that. And one objection is the testimony of Irenaeus. Irenaeus seems to think that this was something that happened under Domitian, and that his testimony is put forward quite a bit. Do you think that Irenaeus's testimony causes a great difficulty for early date advocates?
No, I don't. One of the explanations for that is that basically Domitian did rule for his father in Rome for about 6 months before Vespasian could get into the city and take over for him. So he was kind of on a temporary basis doing this for his father. So we know that. So maybe there's some kind of confusion that Irenaeus has that. But we also know that at this period, he doesn't even know the identity of the person underlying 666. He makes some suggestions, but he far misses the consensus of most scholars today, whether they're pre-70 or late date, that it's Neron Kaiser. That's the person behind this, what we call in Hebrew, gematria, or in Greek, isosephism. Jokingly, for one of the most famous numbers that we have is 666. It's not 666, but it's 666. So, and clearly Nero is the person, it seems, who the readers of Revelation are to understand as the sum of those numbers in his name.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, Irenaeus seems like he gets some things wrong. I mean, there's one passage in Irenaeus where, if I remember right, and you don't have to comment on this because you don't have it in front of you, obviously, but I think there's one place where he puts Jesus's death in like when he's like 50 years old or something. I mean, he doesn't get everything right. That's the point for me, anyways, as I take that. Could I throw another objection out at you, Dr.
So
Wilson? Okay, one objection that people say is that we know that Laodicea was destroyed by an earthquake. A pretty, I don't remember the year that it was.
AD 60.
80, 60. Okay. And
Yeah.
so if he's writing anytime before 70, it seems improbable that this city would be described as being rich and prosperous if it's just been wiped out by a major earthquake.
Yeah. I mean, earthquakes are very common in Asia Minor. Of course, they're still happening here. We, of course, last year had a major earthquake here that destroyed so many cities in eastern and southeastern Turkey, including Antioch on the Orontes, modern Antakya. We know there was a major earthquake in AD 17 that destroyed a number of cities, including Philadelphia and Sardis, and Tiberius gave aid for their rebuilding. And of course, that's what's unique about what happened with Laodicea. They refused the imperial money coming from Rome to rebuild their city. And so this suggests we've got the resources ourselves to go ahead and do this. And basically, if a city this rich is able to get itself up and running in several years. So I see absolutely no objection. They're going to have their whole infrastructure with the water system and streets and everything open within as short a time as possible. But they've got the resources, and I was going to say the manpower. I should say, qualify that and say the slave power to be able to make a rapid turnaround and get the city functioning again and getting it rebuilt in not a problem at all.
Okay, all right. Another objection that I've heard is that some people would say it doesn't seem to fit. It seems like when the scriptures say that specifically to the church of Ephesus, you've lost your first love. That seems to imply maybe some span of time that's taken place that seems to fit a late date better than an early date. Could you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a interesting, again, a metaphor there of Jesus speaking to the church there. I mean, this is the apostolic church. I disagree with the translation that says, because you first lost your first love, I'm going to remove your lampstand. I think the Greek word there is better translated, move your lampstand, which is a perfectly acceptable translation. We get our word from kinetic from kineo there. So Jesus is not saying that he's going to wipe out the church in some way, but this has been the number one church in the province of Asia, the apostolic church where Paul has centered. But if they've lost their love, he's going to replace their position of influence with another church there. And we interestingly have in the latter half of the first century a number of inscriptions that suddenly appear in Ephesus. And these are Philosebastus inscriptions. So they're literally translated, they're emperor lover inscriptions. And
Mm.
so I've written an article and suggesting, we've got all kinds of ideas of what was the first love they lost, but who is the second love that their affections were going to? And so, do we potentially have some of the more elite, upper class people in the church here now are being torn? Do we have to sign on, even erect an inscription and have our name as indicated an emperor lover here? Or can we accommodate that and be a Jesus lover too? Or do we have to make a decision? And I mean, this whole issue of compromise, accommodation is throughout all of these, whether it's in Pergamum or it's in Thyatira or whatever. And so the early church at this time is really struggling with their right affection. So, it's just not in Ephesus, but the other churches too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so that those are some of the main objections that I'm aware of. So in summary, you think that we have good grounds, internal grounds mostly, I would guess you would say, for thinking that the Book of Revelation was written prior to AD 70.
Right. And I think the issue of eating food sacrificed to idols, which is still raging here in the churches, that's something that Paul addressed in First Corinthians as well. I think by the time you get to the end of the first century, this is pretty well settled, but this is still a very active issue in the churches and just another piece of internal evidence. So if you're going to, classify it this way, external evidence points to a late date, but everything inside the book of Revelation points to an early date, and even late daters will agree to that. And most famously is David Awney in his word commentary. He says, well, early evidence, points to it, or the internal evidence to an early date. So it must show that we have a later editing or something that's happened to put it into the later date in order to somehow reconcile that with a presumed late date.
Yeah, I think that that's very telling too. And I noticed this among tendencies among some more liberal scholars. Like I can't remember the one from the International Critical Commentary. I think that was Charles. I can't remember his name for sure. But anyways, he wanted to take portions of it and put it prior to AD 70 and take other portions of it and put it later than AD 70. And for me, it was like, well, if I think the thing was written by John and it's a holistic thing and not
Yeah,
carved
yeah,
up into little pieces,
yeah.
early date seems to make good sense to me.
Yeah, that was Charles's approach, and he was really one of the first ones who swayed. And because, as you rightly said, in the 19th century, commentators, the majority were in favor of the early date, and it was Charles and after then that now began to swing it in the 20th century to the predominant position to the late date.
Yeah. And so I really appreciate this, Dr. Wilson. This is really great insight. For those of you who have only watched this video, I'd encourage you to watch one of the others that I've made. I'll put a link in the description, Dr. Wilson, where he lays out for us some of the archaeological evidence. He's actually living in Turkey, and this is really his field of expertise, is this area of Asia. And so I'd like to invite you to watch that. And Dr. Wilson, we'd like to thank you for being on our channel today.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
All right. Thank you so much.